Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. Today, we have our guest speakers, Erinna and Natalie Bormann, who are here to share their experiences growing up in East and West Germany as they answer questions from four students of German. And a big special thank you to the Goethe-Institut for putting this together and giving students the opportunity, this unique opportunity to learn about Germany's history. Before we begin with the questions, please allow me to introduce our panelists. Erinna was born in Glauchau, Saxony in 1970 and grew up there as an only child. Her father was the technical director of the local hospital. Early on, Erinna learned that she lived in a country where freedom was limited and where the government dictated which career you were allowed or were not allowed to have. In August 1989, Erinna, at the age of 17 years, escaped from the GDR via Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria. Only a few months later, on November 9th, 1989, she witnessed the unexpected fall of the Berlin Wall from the other side of the border in the Federal Republic of Germany. Today, Erinna lives in the United States and works as a teacher of German in Boston. We also have with us today Natalie Bormann. She was born in 1974 in North Rhine-Westphalia, close to the city of Köln, where she moved later to attend university. Her father's family moved from a small town near Leipzig. They had been able to flee to the west in the 1950s, before Leipzig became a part of the GDR and before the wall was built. Natalie grew up not knowing much about the GDR, the conditions there, and the relatives that her family left behind. It was not something that her family or friends talked about. She remembers visiting East Berlin once during a school excursion when her class was allowed to cross the border for a day. She found this experience quite profound and felt that it was like visiting a different country. She traveled extensively before completing her PhD and working in the UK. She still has not been to Leipzig. Today, Natalie lives in the United States and is a professor of political science in Boston. Also joining us today, we have four student panelists. We have Fox Rifenberg Stempel from Shaker High School in New York, Bert Mocklebust from Mahopac High School, also in New York. We have Luiza Vazquez from Mount Lebanon High School in Pennsylvania, and myself, Sofia Sepulveda-Pizarro from East Brunswick High School, New Jersey. So our student panelists are going to take turns asking questions to our experts. And first up, we have Fox, who is going to be asking Erinna his question.
All right, so my question is, what was the education system like in East Germany, and what were you taught about West Germany and German history?
So thanks for your question. To answer it, the education system was a centralized system, and it was controlled by the Ministry of Education. And by centralized, I mean, if you would, for instance, from one part of East Germany to another part and attend school, then you would jump immediately into the content of, for instance, mathematics, what you dealt with in your hometown. I think compared to other systems, it was a well-rounded educational system. So for instance, I had world literature, or I even know about the United States, geography or economy. We had world history, English, languages, music, science, sports. However, the majority of those subjects was influenced by socialistic or communist ideas. And was I taught about West Germany and German history? I mean, I went through German history from the very beginning to the very end. But of course, it was always influenced by the ideology of the country I lived in. And I knew about we were taught about West Germany's economical and political system. And of course, it was our biggest and closest enemy because it was part of the NATO and the ally, the strongest ally of the United States, which was the enemy then the Soviet Union. And yeah, in German history, that I was taught everything from the beginning to the end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And now my question for Natalie is, what were you taught in school, if anything, about life in East Germany, particularly in comparison to West Germany?
Hello, also thank you for that question. The answer will be very short. That is to say, I have no recollection of learning much about life in Eastern Germany and in East Berlin or the eastern parts. And I say this from the perspective of, you know, being sort of a young teenager at the time. It's certainly nothing to be proud of now, looking back at that. But I don't think we were taught much about everyday life in East Germany. I certainly learned much about the historical circumstances, the historical facts, the political proclivities of the time in terms of West and East Germany, but not so much about, you know, societies, everyday life, differences between East and West. And I would describe it, sort of thinking back, I would describe it as learning about East Germany in the same way as we would learn about another foreign country. And, you know, sort of thinking back now, I think that was on purpose. So that is to say, it wasn't encouraged to think about East Germany as, you know, part of the West. I think we were not encouraged to be sort of insightful or to have insights into East German life. It wasn't a central concern in terms of my schooling. Yeah. And, you know, I'm trying to also think about the question in relation to what Diana was telling us about the East and how the East was looking at the West. There was certainly no invitation to look at the East and to, you know, to study it in detail.
All right, thank you.
My first question for Diana is, what compelled you and gave you the courage to start a new life at such a young age?
I think to easily travel new roads without fear and being full of rebellion and also without planning things through. So this was also my case. I was at the time, so when I first had the vision to leave or made the plan to leave, I was 14. But then in '89, I went. I was full of rebellion to do something with my life, and I knew I wouldn't live in this system. Additionally, when I was a teenager, I didn't possess property or a family of my own, so in a sense, I was very free, and also my family background, certain teachers and friends formed me to be courageous. And if I started something, I most of the time finished through. So once the idea was in my head, I had this goal, I wanted to reality. But I think the real source of it all was the thought that I was never able, I would have never been able to live my life the way I wanted, with interference by the government, and that really pushed me. So I wanted to be free and live my ideals freely. So whatever I wanted to do, I wanted to do it, and I didn't want it to be stopped by the government.
Thank you so much for your answer. My question for Natalie is, how did your visit to the GDR change your perception of East Germany and its inhabitants? And did that change the way that you viewed the world around you and where your family came from?
So I always look at this one visit that I had as part of a school trip to East Berlin as a moment that I always remember when I think about what do I know about East Germany, what do I know about East Berlin. So that to me is this one moment, and it certainly hasn't left me. And now I'm much older now than when back then in the days I visited. I say that because just sort of to preface this, I was perhaps 13 or 14 years old. So sort of an impressionable teenager. And just to set the stage with regard to what a 13 or 14-year-old would be impressed by when visiting a place of that order. And what I was impressed by in those days was the kind of visual component of visiting East Berlin. And that's certainly something that we hear very often or read in history books. But that was also my impression. I felt I was entering a place that was devoid of color. I remember grayness, I remember tower blocks. And that's to me really quite interesting as an observation, because where I grew up, which is, you know, sort of in the close to the Rhineland and also the Ruhr Valley, which are actually quite industrial cities and places in Germany that are also very gray, you know, due to the nature of the industries. And so with that in mind, to then still perceive this visit to East Berlin as sort of a gray space devoid of color was something that impressed me. The other thing that left an impression was, and again, this also came from my experience that I had up to then. I was used to traveling a lot. I traveled to Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, Austria, Switzerland. So I was used to crossing borders. I was used to showing my passport. I was used to what it's like to be policed at sort of a border crossing. And so when we entered East Berlin as a school group, we went through the same procedures. And I remember thinking that was really quite odd, because I wasn't going to a foreign country as such. So, you know, all these kind of impressions were in relation to what I had already experienced elsewhere. So that to me struck me as really quite interesting. There was sort of a strictness and a border control that seemed very out of place and unexpected to me. And then the last impression of that whole day that we spent in East Berlin was the fact that there was nothing to do. So I have memories of exchanging money, which you had to do, right? So from Deutschmark to East German Mark. And I exchanged 20 Deutschmark, which is about $30 perhaps. And we spent all day in East Berlin sort of roaming the streets, and I had no opportunity to spend that money. And that was just something that sort of struck me. There was no there weren't any shops. There was nothing that I would find interesting or worth purchasing. And I basically returned with that kind of memory that, it was gray. I had to cross a border like I would when I traveled to Italy. And then there was really nothing to purchase, nothing to take back in that sort of way. Sort of by way of summary, perhaps, and I say that from the perspective of a teenager. It's not something that I would sort of say now. I felt pity. I felt sorry for those who had to live in those conditions. I felt pity, which I think is a terrible feeling to feel. And I certainly did not feel that, these were German citizens in the way you would think about it.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now, Luiza is going to ask her questions.
Hello. So I was wondering, Diana, what was your ultimate motivation to flee the GDR? And was there a specific moment or person or realization that you had that motivated that?
Thank you, Luiza, for your question. Yeah, the ultimate motivation to flee. As I told before, when I was 14, I started to form the idea, vision, once I have a degree, I'm going to leave the country. And so age-wise, this would have been, or this was when I became 18. And the reasons for that were not only, so I had a basic education, but also to be free in terms of, so freedom of speech. That was something you couldn't do in East Germany. And I wanted to live a self-determined life. As Natalie mentioned, like traveling to Switzerland or Italy or places was, of course, it sounded great, but this was, I wouldn't say very special, because if you cannot live your own life the way you wanted, what would have it mattered to me? Yeah. So once I could achieve this, then everything else would be an addition, and I would have enjoyed, of course. So I wanted to live a self-determined life where I could choose, for instance, to clean public toilets if I wanted to, or teach German if that was what I decided for my life. And I wanted to live what I had envisioned for myself and not what a government would dictate me. So for instance, I wanted, so in 8th grade, everyone basically had to know what they wanted to become. So some wanted to be a doctor, or some an electrician or a hairdresser, and I want to become a language teacher. So I Russian and English school, and I loved Russian very much. I had a super teacher, and I liked her a lot. But I thought, well, then you end up in the Soviet Union then, and what are you going to do there? So I thought maybe it might be better to study English, because I had a teacher at high school who was sent to England like 3 weeks or so to do a professional development, which was very unusual. And I thought maybe this is going to happen to me too. So therefore I said, I want to study German and English to become a teacher. However, there were some small episodes at school where I didn't agree with the school's political idea, so I had a little problem, and in the end I was refused to study this, and they advised me to study German and Russian. And so this was just one, one challenge, or when I was when I was all clear with leaving and doing what I want to do and not what someone else wanted to do. And it totally agree, super gray. I don't know. It's like this country didn't know colors. I mean, it's just, there was not much in the stores, you know, you'd have connection to get stuff. But this was just a very time living there. Other bigger things were more important. I think I had a strong will and wanted to do whatever I wanted to do and didn't want it to be influenced by the government. So this was a motivation.
All right, Natalie, I was wondering what events in the East motivated your family's flight in the 1950s, well before Leipzig even became part of the GDR.
So this is a very good question, and I began telling my memories about what I know about East Germany from the point of a 14-year-old. But this question I have only heard the answer to last year. And I think that's really important because my parents, or my father's family, had to flee Leipzig, which would then become part of East Germany. And before I even answer that question in detail, I want to just sort of set the context a little bit and why this was never shared with me and wasn't a point of conversation in my home. I think we need to think about the division of Germany and then the building of the wall and the falling of the wall as sort of a really traumatic, maybe this is an obvious thing to say, a very traumatic experience for Germans for a number of reasons, but especially because it came at the heels of a previous traumatic event, which was the Second World War. And that certainly applied to my family and my father's wish not to talk about these kinds of episodes of his life. And so while I don't want to take us off track, I do think it matters. So you are talking about, and this is my father, you're talking about a 6, 7, 8-year-old child who is forced to flee his home in Leipzig only about 6, 7 years after he was born there, under the bombardment of the Allies, which, you know, he was born in 1944, just shy before the end of the Second World War. And so he experienced that war/post-war world where his family had to rebuild their lives, right? So his first year of his life, he spent in a bunker in his backyard. And so they rebuilt their lives, but it's a very precarious life. And we have the beginning of the Cold War. And the situation in Leipzig and the beginning of the division is felt, and is felt in the society and the community where he grew up. So specifically, he tells me that he grew up on this farm with his mother and his stepfather, because his biological father was killed in the Second World War. And they had a pig farm, doesn't matter. But the point is that there were rumors that the community wanted to expel his stepfather and his family and report them to the local police. You know, it was already developing to be a surveillance state. And so the community was eyeing this particular farm as something they wanted to get rid of. So there was a lot of, I don't know, chaos and anxiety in this community. And so my father's parents decided to leave everything behind that they had just built to then flee to the West. And I know this is sort of a very short version of a much longer story, but I think the important part to answering your question and to that story is that this was not a story told in my family, and I don't think in many families, because it came at the heels of a very tumultuous episode in German history. So it's nothing that anyone really wanted to talk about. So fleeing physically was also a means to flee these kinds of stories and these experiences. And I only know about this because I actually set my father down, not because he really wanted to voluntarily share the story of his upbringing. So.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Living in East Germany, did you live life feeling as though you were constantly looking over your shoulders?
So the short answer is yes. Oh gosh, this is a tough one. How can I explain? So since I was able to speak, able to understand language, able to understand my parents, I started to learn new, which was take good care what you say, to whom you befriend. So my parents always, every day, discussed and talked about politics on the kitchen table when we had our meals. And I, of course, would sit there and listen to this stuff. And my parents were very much against the system. So my mother was really tough. So she always wanted to move to the West or to immigrate to the West. And my father was, he would love to, but he was very much sad because he was an academic. He wouldn't find a job. It was the 80s, and there was a lot of unemployment in West Germany. So they always discuss, should we not, what would happen to our families and parents and so on. And I wouldn't contribute to the discussion because of course I had a child then, but I would listen to their arguments and the reason and all this. And I would school and hear a different story, and then I'd go home, and then in the evening only watch the thought of East German TV as no program. So I would listen to the West German side again. Probably I watched most of the things that Natalie watched, because then there were only like 2 major broadcasts and maybe the local ones, like a Bavarian broadcast or German broadcasts. And so I watched also these. So it was a little bit like growing up in West Germany too. I had a good picture about this. And I understood that if I said certain things that I just saw on West German TV and political programs, for instance, I would get into trouble. So therefore, I did not mention anything, or if I knew certain friends were in this kind of circle of friends that I could trust, and then we would discuss these things too. And we also, what I realized later on, so I grew up with this, was we developed in a way a different language. So maybe if you listened in your classes to East German music, East German songs, most of these singers, they transported a message which was Western oriented, or something needs to change, but they didn't say it openly. They would put it into poetical language. And the same, I worked, and many of my very good friends worked. And I came to realize this when I lived with my friends, East friends. They also escaped. We lived in Munich, and we lived in an apartment together. And the biggest thing on a Friday after work was buying food, hurrying home, and then playing cards. There was a certain for people. But there was a good friend of one of us. She was from Munich, so she was West German, and she joined us. So in this card game, it's either 1 plays against 3 or 2 against 2. So, and by finding out who plays with each other, or again, you throw yourself certain codes. You couldn't say, you know, directly what you had, but you would talk around it. And the funny thing, whenever one played with her, she couldn't understand the codes. And it was so strange. I realized very much later why this never worked. Yeah, because she didn't grow up with it. So we understood this kind of language, she didn't. And then also another example is, for instance, my dad, because of his profession, was one of the privileged ones who had a telephone. So it was super rare that people had telephones. And he was given one, and sometimes we would have a call. We got a call from West German relatives, and we couldn't just say like, oh, hi, Aunt Mary. Oh, it's great. Your parcel is great. You know, we got all the coffee and the chewing gum, and I don't know, a jeans that's in there, and the newspaper or whatever. So because every time you picked up that phone, there was a little kind of click. And then you were not the only one who was listening to the conversation, but it was the Secret Service. So you had to also change the language you talked. So you would say, hi, Aunt Mary. Oh, 3 days ago, the sun was shining and it was all great, you know, I enjoyed the weather. So then they knew, oh, 3 days ago, you received the parcel and everything was great and you got what was in there. So, and up until today, I think I have this coded language somewhere in me. I sometimes feel it. So when I'm with East Germans together, you talk like, you are like 3 streets ahead with your thoughts, you know, and West Germans sometimes can't follow. I'm not sure for Natalie how it was in our conversations, but I still feel like this. And what you said about looking over your shoulder, I still have this here too. So it follows me. I remember number plates, for instance, from car plates, you know, or certain people, what do they wear? And I still hate calling people on the phone. So it left a huge thing on me. Thanks, Bert, for the question.
Thank you for the answer. Miss Natalie, I was wondering that although your family didn't talk much about East Germany, I was wondering, like, throughout your daily life, have you heard little bits and information that kind of clued you in on how life was over there?
So I just, before answering the question, suddenly I realized, Diana, I never understood you. Okay, so did I hear bits and pieces or some information about the East? No. And you know, in some of the previous parts of our conversation, I think I alluded to the fact that, so when you think about how do you hear about, how would you hear about this? Right? How would you hear about life conditions, politics in the East, in East Germany? Well, we talked about school, and I said that I do not recall, and there could be other reasons for it. I could not recall being let in on everyday life in East Germany. That wasn't really a topic of conversation, and we studied East Germany in the same way we would study other countries, as sort of a historical or political phenomenon over there. So school wasn't the place. I mentioned that in my family, we didn't really talk about this. And this changed when the wall fell, when there was an opportunity to reunite families, and when there were particular sort of triggers to begin talking about it, and everyone began reminiscing about what they remembered, and there was sort of an opening up of society, but also of family conversations. But then I think the other space where one would gain insights into bits and pieces of information of life in East Germany is and was and is the media. And that was really the place where I got most of my information about life in East Germany. So just like you would, just like anyone else would, whether you lived in West Germany at the time or whether you lived in the UK or anywhere else at the time, I think I would say that I accessed the same kind of information about East Germany from the papers as other people would, which is really odd in many ways. I was thinking about the conversation that we have had thus far and how I would describe the presence of East Germany in my upbringing. I used the word traumatized. I mean, I wasn't traumatized, but certainly my father was. So it was sort of a traumatized part of the German experience for certain people. But I think East Germany was kind of invisible to my upbringing, and I think I wasn't unique in that, or my experience wasn't unique in that East Germany was not, and this will sound very exaggerated, but wasn't really on the map in terms of how I was educated or brought up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of our experts and our students for their great questions and answers. And now we will be moving on to the second round. So if Fox can ask his next set of questions.
All right. So my second question for Diana is, what did you learn about the Soviet Union and its involvement in Germany while growing up in East Germany?
Thanks for your question. So this is a big question, but to be short, what did I learn about the Soviet Union? So from school, for instance, I was taught that the Soviet Union is our ally, East Germany's ally. It's probably the best country in the world, and they freed Germans from Nazi Germany. So this was probably it. But I had also courses like world history and Russian, where I was connected to the culture and the language, and of course the of the Soviet Union. And besides, there were Soviet soldiers stationed in my town. So once the Nazi Germans moved out of these barracks, the Soviets came in, and they weren't, for many people in my town, especially my mother, they weren't looked at as human beings. I mean, according to my mother, they had no culture. They put new windows instead of curtains, or fish on the windows that they had caught in a lake there. And I always was fascinated by this stuff because it was different from I grew up. And then also I learned the language, I spoke the language. So of course it was part of politics to visit the soldiers and see what East Germany, the whole world, by freeing the world from the Nazis. But besides the political stuff, I mean, it was just cool to practice Russian, you know, to speak, to say stuff, and they even understood and would reply to me, or I would read the Cyrillic letters and understood and could decode these words, you know. And so this was like, it was like diving into a completely different world. So also the way they are dressed, the way the women looked like, lots of makeup, very blonde hair, for instance, or very red hair, for instance. This was all fascinating to me. And besides this, I learned about poets, and of course Lenin, who played a huge role, and I saw pictures. My Russian teacher would always bring pictures back while she was when she was on vacation on Crimea. Then it was. Now it's Russia, then she considered herself kind of Ukrainian. And it was just, it was interesting. And I was not so much like, it wasn't that I tended because of the East German media or because of the ideology in school, thinking that the Soviet Union is now the greatest nation on earth, because I always watched West German TV and heard the other side of the story. So I was in a good equilibrium of what was said on one side and what was said on the other side. Didn't mean that both sides didn't exaggerate a little bit here and there, but I could find or form my own opinion about countries or people, for instance, or cultures in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Now my second question for Natalie is, what shocked you the most when you visited East Germany?
So just to maybe take us back to who I was when I visited East Germany, I think that is very important. So we're talking about an impressionable 13 to 14-year-old teenager, traveling with, other teenagers, and traveling with, if you like, a set of expectations or experiences that we had growing up. And so there may be sort of a set of moments that one could describe as shocking, and some of those I alluded to already. But if we maybe think about those a little bit further or deeper, I think what shocked me was that this whole performance of going to East Germany or visiting East Germany labeled us or depicted us as tourists, right? So I was a tourist to East Germany, which defied sort of our understanding of what we were doing to begin with. So this was, a divided country, but Germany nonetheless. And I was undergoing all these kinds of steps that you would do as if you were a tourist. Right, so you have to show your passport, you have to exchange money, this is a different country, there's police at the border, that kind of stuff. So I think that was already quite shocking to me. At the same time, so the next point, being made to feel as though you are a tourist, you couldn't really do the kinds of touristy things. So going back to the point that I made earlier, there wasn't sort of a lot to see. Everything felt very restricted. There wasn't much to explore and accessible to us. There weren't any things I could purchase as sort of memories. Everything that you can think of that you would do as a tourist, I wasn't really able to do. And so it left you wondering, what kind of role were you actually playing on this visit if you couldn't do all that? I also would say what shocked me was, and I say this now not as a 13 or 14-year-old, but the things that shocked me, I couldn't buy anything. There was nothing to purchase. The houses looked gray and not so nice. Everything was sort of experienced and assessed and evaluated through a particular capitalist frame. And I know this sounds now very grand, but I do remember that was kind of the takeaway, that there was a very clear division experienced, but that experience was felt on those kind of capitalist fault lines. Right? I can do everything. I can purchase everything. When I visited, I couldn't do any of that. I can travel extensively. I have that sense of open societies and an open economy, you know, the bedrock of capitalism. But my experience of visiting was that that was kind of the opposite. And so, you know, Diana's previous comments about that may have been the case. Houses were gray, shops were empty, but that wasn't really at the heart of the society that she was living in. But that was how I looked at this, because that was the kind of lens that I, as a 13, 14-year-old growing up in West Germany, would apply to my surroundings. And so, you know, the question of what was particularly shocking was that I entered an environment where that particular lens didn't really apply somehow. And I was left thinking I didn't know what to do with that.
All right, thank you so much.
My second question is for Diana. What were some of the most challenging things that you had to go through after you successfully escaped from East Germany?
To be very honest, I cannot remember of big challenges to overcome. I mean, if you would move to a different country, it's mostly the language that's a barrier for people, and it wasn't there. Maybe my dialect might have been a barrier, but I never had any issue with it. Of course, I tried to give my best German. and really not, I thought of, yeah, I cannot remember of challenges. And okay, I had a high school diploma. I knew I had something finished. And I knew I need money, and how do you get it? By working. So I find and or edge job, and that's what I did. So and I wasn't picky on what came along my way. So I would have done probably nearly every job that's serious. And so I found work, and in the end I had 2 jobs. I was working during the day as a mailwoman delivering mail, and I had great colleagues. I would leave the house early in the morning and take the bus, I remember, to this post office distribution center with a lot of foreign workers, mostly Turkish guest workers, which was interesting. And I had great colleagues. I enjoyed being outside when delivering the mail. I got to know people, and I got to know their culture, how they are, which was totally foreign to me. And I had good conversations. And in the evening, I worked at a locally owned delicatessen shop. And it was small. I got to know the foods there and the higher end foods and prices, and I would sit on the cash register, and so I earned their trust, which happened very quickly. You know, I could work there, and I would also talk to the customers, which I enjoyed, and there were interesting conversations that I had there, but probably the very best of it all was that sometimes I was allowed by the owners to try their delivery of Belgian pralines, you know, to have chocolates, to have a better overview and understanding what to sell to customers, which wasn't at all a bad job. And I earned money, and I enjoyed my life. And at that time, the political atmosphere towards East German escapees was positive and enthusiastic at that time. And most people were very friendly. So yeah, they were helpful, they were supporting, they tried, you know, to find you a job or bring you to a certain person that could help you again with stuff. And so it was very different from what it became a little later on. Yeah, so yeah, so I cannot think of any major challenges here. I would consider them very normal if you come to a different country. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that answer. It is very eye-opening to think about that, how maybe it wasn't so difficult. My next question for Natalie is, do you think it is important for people to acknowledge their past, the good and the bad experiences, in order to build a better future?
I love that question. It really is a very thoughtful, beautiful question. I say that also because the question is at the heart of my work. And I, you know, for me, it's sort of a beautiful moment to fast forward from telling stories about being 13, 14, to look at sort of my life today and to realize that what I have been sharing and the questions you've been asking have really informed who I am today and what I wanted to do professionally in a way. Because yes, I do think it is necessary to remember not only the good, but the bad bits too. And in fact, I would argue that it's my duty to do that. And when you put the various conversation pieces together that we had about, you know, sort of my ignorant Western German upbringing, not really knowing what's happening behind that wall, and not hearing much about it, and sort of living my life uninterruptedly with that invisible other part, I think there is a sort of a shameful part to that that needs to be reckoned with. And I would say that if you ever get to visit Berlin, and you must, once this pandemic is sort of wrapped up, but if you ever get to visit Berlin, you will see that there are so many traces of efforts to remember the good and the bad past. And, you know, Diana can tell you much about that too. There's a lot of effort not to erase any of that history or the narratives, and in fact to point to experiences like I had, those shameful, I didn't really know what was going on over there, and to ensure that that doesn't really happen. And so even though the wall doesn't exist, there are traces of the walls, sort of artistic renderings of the wall in Berlin, to make sure that we all remember that it was there, even though, you know, it's not there. So there's sort of a famous, in sort of the academic world, there is a famous phrase that says about Germany that the whole country is a monument. And it's true, and I don't think it's a bad thing. And what is being said with that phrase is that there is a lot of effort to find ways to commemorate, to remember, to honor the past, and to confess to that. And, you know, as I said before, to use that sort of as a warning, so that we don't engage in the certain kind of practices again, but also as a, I guess, sort of a teaching moment to celebrate that we have left that behind and moved forward in those ways. Great question.
Thank you so much for that answer. Now moving on to Luiza's questions.
So my second question for Diana is, what challenges did you face when you were escaping the GDR via Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria?
So there were many challenges, but I mentioned just a few. So before I actually fled I returned back from a failed attempt to flee. So from the Hungarian-Austrian border, for the first time, I was escorted by Hungarian and then Czechoslovakian soldiers to enter the train back home from Bratislava, which was then in Czechoslovakia. So needed a visa for Hungary. So when I reapplied for a visa to Hungary, it was granted to me, which was very, very strange, because normally, you know, the border control would have probably sent information to the police and blah, 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 and then they would have not granted a visa, and probably the people would have come to our house and investigated what's going on and interrogated me with questions. But at this time, there was so much going on, so many people fled. The embassies were full. In Poland, there was chaos, you know, everywhere there was something going on. So I think they had a little bit too much to do, so they couldn't follow it up. So I was granted another visa, and once I packed my little red backpack, I put very few things inside, like I don't think I had an extra pair of shoes, and I just had the second pair of pants and another top. And the border control stopped trains from East Germany to Czechoslovakia, which normally didn't happen because you didn't need a visa to the other country. But then they started to stop them, and they would go through the wagons and look at people's luggage, and also would take people out. So I had really a tiny red backpack, I remember, and they would open the doors to where I sat with other people that I didn't know, and everything, they looked at the luggage and everything seemed to be okay. So we were okay, but however, there was another person I remember who had hidden, so no luggage, who had hidden a valuable coin collection in his boots. And they found him because he locked himself up in the bathroom, and he didn't open the door. So this was suspicious. So they took him out, and then they found all these coins because he probably took them in to sell them, you know, once he reached West Germany. So he was gone. And once I was in Hungary, so there were, I mean, I didn't see them or didn't pay much attention, but I know now that Hungary and Budapest was full with Secret Service police, East German Secret Service police. So I'm not sure if I was very important. I mean, I was 18 years at the time. Who would care about me, you know? I mean, I just was there, and it was not unusual for very young East Germans to travel to a foreign country on their own, as a woman also, no problem. So who would care? So, but I know East German Secret Service would, secret police would like falsely befriend East Germans, you know, and then they would take them with them, or stuff like this happened. So I didn't really have to face this. But nevertheless, as I grew up, I always made sure, you know, to look over my shoulder and see, you know, is there someone following me? So, and of course, you didn't have like a GPS or on your phone, you know, to know, oh, I take X street and now I take Y street, you know, it will bring me to the border. You had to make a good guess and follow maps and stuff to find your way. So, but I mean, this is the way we grew up with, and that was just normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. And for Natalie, how did your upbringing contribute to your choice of career later in life as a professor of political science?
Yeah, that's another great question, and a follow-up question to the previous question about, do we have sort of a duty to remember the good and the bad bits? I think, I don't know if this has come through, but the kinds of experiences that I have shared here as this impressionable 13, 14-year-old, who, and listening now to Diana, this should be very clear, who lived a very sheltered life. I always had visions to traveling west and south, and had all sorts of opportunities and had choices to make, even with regard to what I should concern myself with, and it wasn't East Germany. And I hope it came through that I think it's quite a shameful experience. And I would say that, the division of Germany, the building of a wall, and everything that I had described was seen as really a shameful part of German history, a traumatic part. And I use these words now a couple of times. And so I say that because I think I grew up with, and I'm not on my own in this, a whole German society has grown up with a variety of shameful sort of historical spots, but I grew up with carrying that with me, and it has become part of my personal life. I shared that I still today have conversations with my own family about, remind me again, what was your upbringing like? Why don't you share that with me? So, which is also quite a common phenomenon in German society. So we still have this reckoning personally. But I think because it has followed me up to today, or my sort of adult life, it also snuck in my professional life. And when I talk about how I chose to become a professor or to be interested in what I do, I always do say that, at least partially, predominantly, it is informed by traveling through these experiences of German society that left me with this kind of sense of, I need to expose this, I need to make it transparent, I need to be honest about it, I need to share this, I need to educate others about this kind of history. And I have that sort of on my shoulders, and to be shared, right? So to carry with me, so in order for it not to be forgotten. And it certainly has informed all of my academic work, for sure. So it's not an accident that I have this big chunk of German history in my professional and personal life.
Thank you so much for that, Anna.
And now if Bert could ask his questions.
My second question is for Miss Diana. I was wondering how you had to mentally prepare yourself for when you were going to flee from the GDR.
Mentally preparation. Well, I can honestly not remember what I did or if I did anything, but of course, you play through the worst case scenario. So what I thought then was, first of all, two things. First of all, I would never be able to see my past for a very, very long time. That is until I would be retired and maybe then could go to the West. However, to make a positive thought out of it, I thought, okay, my grandparents are retired and they could freely travel back and forth. So they could have been the ones giving me information about my parents. So this was one thing. And the question was, can I deal with not being in contact with my parents, in direct contact or visiting them? And I thought, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm 18. I would have left this house anyways with 18 as soon as I could, honestly, to be on my own and live a kind of a free life. So this would have not bothered me. I mean, I could have written letters. The question was, would they ever arrive? I could have called them maybe. As I said, you know, there was always our friend listening also. So, but it would have been possible. So, and then, but the second problem that I envisioned was, okay, what if it's not working out, and what if they catch me? And then it would have happened that I would have been come to prison. They would have put me into probably an East German prison. And as I know now, many more things about East German prisons, this was more or less hell, which I didn't know then. I know it was a prison, and there is this picture about a prison. Yes, you cannot go outside. Maybe the food is not great. Maybe you have to work, but more or less, that's what I knew. But the thing was, to turn it into something positive, is that if you were a political prisoner, the chance was that West Germany would buy you. So there was a deal with West Germany because East Germany didn't have any money. They were basically bankrupt. So in order to fill their pockets, West Germany would pay a certain amount of money for every prisoner and would give it to the East German government. On one hand, East Germans were considered Germans to West Germany. They kind of belonged to their country too, because like East Germany was, as Natalie also said it, not really there. I mean, they wouldn't really recognize it as a country. This came much, much later. So East Germans were also Germans, West Germans, you know, they were all like brothers and sisters belonging to one family. However, they would pay money to free certain people. And I had the hope, well, if I stay in prison, then maybe they picked me and after maybe 2 years or 3 years in prison, I would be in the West anyways. So this gave me hope. So no matter what I did, there was something positive about it. So therefore, my mind was nothing to worry about. Everything will be okay this way or the other. I don't know if this makes any sense, but if you want to achieve something and you already start with a lot of fear, I don't think it'll happen or happen well. So of course there were downsides, but I thought, no, yeah, okay, if this is the case, then maybe this will turn out this way. And can I live with it? Yes, I could. And those two things I could live with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting way to look at things, and it's a very nice perspective to have on anything in life, you know, just a good way to think about things. And my second question for Miss Natalie is, after your trip to East Berlin, how did your feelings or opinions about their culture, their affairs, and just the nation itself change, if they changed at all?
It's not sort of a singular feeling. I think there is sort of a, how did I describe this before? Sort of a journey of feelings, which you know, is a good thing. But immediately after the visit, and you know, we described this as sort of a moment of shock. It was very alien. It didn't fit into the expectations that we had when we visited. And so, you know, immediately, the immediate feeling was that of sort of an awareness, something that we in this particular circumstance weren't really aware of. And so, and from that feeling of awareness, okay, so this is what it looks like, comes then that feeling of anger. And I'm sure there is there's some kind of theory about the steps of feelings that you go through. But the sort of a moment of anger, because even though we didn't live in East Germany, or I didn't live in East Germany. I sort of felt cheated on not knowing that this was something that existed, or that wasn't really discussed, that wasn't debated, that wasn't made a central point of conversation. And that really applies to what I said before. I was angry with sort of school. Why don't we talk about this? I was angry with my own family. Why don't we talk about this? Also a very German phenomenon. And so the kind of moment of shock because of awareness turned into anger. And then I think there were sort of there were two feelings that emerged. One, which is the unfortunate next step of anger often, is sort of a turning away from it in a way. So I say that as an educator who teaches on difficult topics, that often when we get angered or we get paralyzed by having a shock experience about what we just learn or see, we tend to shut down and we turn away from it and we don't really want to deal with that. And that was certainly the next step of that feeling from that moment of seeing East Germany. But then, you know, after a while, once you sort of grow and you hear more about it and you return to that feeling or that moment of anger, let's say, I think that then translated into a very constructive, insightful feeling of something that then I carried with me into my later years, and also in school and at university, you know, the kind of asking of particular kinds of questions that were born in that moment of visiting East Germany, and no one really talks about it. So questions about what about walls, or questions about you know, citizenship, questions about migration, questions about violence, questions about police states and policing, questions about transparency in governments. And, you know, these are very big topics, I understand that. But I do feel that having had that window into something that I feel was not disclosed to us growing up in West Germany, created this kind of energy to make sure that this always needs to be transparent, and a lot of asking of questions. I think probing and sort of a critical appraisal of political structures came from that particular experience. Yes, that's it. I liked my answer.
Thank you. It was very insightful for just seeing how that one experience just shaped everything going forward. Thank you.
And that concludes our panel for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining, especially our guest speakers, Diana, Erinna, and Natalie Bormann. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. It truly is a unique experience, and your perspectives are really, as I said, unique, and it was a pleasure to be able to hear them. And of course, thank you to Luiza, Fox, and Bert for being here and asking all of your amazing questions.
I also wanted to thank you guys all for this opportunity and experience. It was really insightful and I really enjoyed it. I guess I had just one question left over for Natalie. I was just wondering if there were any mishaps on the trip to East Germany, either with like the students or the teachers, because I know from my own German teacher, he went to visit the wall in his 20s and someone tried to take a picture of it and they were nearly detained by the border patrol or something like that. I just thought it was a really funny story. So do you have anything like that to share?
Yeah, you know, I don't remember. I don't remember anything going wrong, but I just want to, you know, I wish I could, you know, I was thinking the more we ask questions about this and the more I found myself reminiscing, I really felt one really has to paint that picture properly. Like a 13, 14-year-old girl, I was in love, you know. My life was just about you know, what teenagers tend to do. It was burdensome to go to East Germany. It was burdensome to, like, what, passports and money, and I can't buy what I want, and I'm thirsty and I want a coffee. And, you know, this, it's not a pretty picture of a teenager, but, and maybe it's sort of a cartoon image of it. But I did want to pitch that the ignorance, right, that was a reflection of how ignorant West Germany maybe was, but also, you know, everyday life went on regardless of what happens behind the wall. And so I think, to your question, I think I perceived everything on that day as just things going wrong. Like, oh, someone asking for this, and, you know, don't take a picture, constantly being disciplined, you know, don't do this, don't do that. In that context of where I was at in my own life, it all felt burdensome, if you like. Yeah. And, you know, I did also, just because it's part of my academic work as well, you kind of have to think about, and this is what I meant by anger, about the way I was educated or not educated about this. So this was a trip that was part of a larger school trip to Berlin. And so, you know, we went for 3-4 days, whatever. We saw all these other great sites in Berlin. And then as another tourist activity, you also visit East Germany and gaze at how people live behind the wall, which, again, the whole sort of setup is, I don't know, it leaves a lot of questions, really. So I know that didn't fully answer your question. I don't, you know, I perceived everything as just everything went wrong that day.
Yeah, I'd probably be in the same headset if I were 13 or 14. That's completely understandable.
Could I maybe, and I don't want to sort of occupy the space with my voice, but I also want to applaud your questions, all of your questions. You know, full disclosure, Diana and I, we texted yesterday saying, there's so many questions. And but, you know, as sort of an applause to you, these were amazing questions. Yeah. And you know, I felt sort of proud and excited about this. And yeah, they came from this wonderful place of curiosity and excitement. And so thank you for these questions.
Yeah, I thank you too. I think the same, yeah. It was a pleasure to read through these questions, to think, to think through these questions, and to bring back memories or stuff that's not there anymore, and to think about, oh, yeah, why did you actually do, or why did I actually do it this way or that, or, you know, like stuff like this, which I normally don't think about. But thank you very much